Welcome to another episode of the SNA Speakeasy. Today we are talking, not for the first time, to a guest in Washington, D.C. I think it's our second time. And his name is Nathan Park. And he is, as I believe, an attorney, and he's also does some writing. So why don't you tell us a little bit about well, since our topic is about South Korea's COVID-19 issue, which is a little bit off from Washington, D.C., and being an attorney, how is it you became interested and knowledgeable about this topic?
Sure. So it's entirely fair to say that, much to my father's disappointment, I'm not a doctor. I'm an attorney. And but I have been writing for quite some time about East Asian politics and economy broadly. I started my writing career on top of my legal practice as a contributing writer for the Wall Street Journal of Korea back in 2016, and then since then I've been writing regularly to a number of outlets, including Foreign Policy, CNN, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal also. So when I talk about South Korea's response to COVID-19, I'm not necessarily talking about sort of the public health aspect or the medical aspect to it. Those aspects are beyond me. What I can speak to is how the government responded to it as a matter of policy, how politics complicated the response.
Okay, well, we've got the right guy then, because I also couldn't tell you anything about the medical side of things. I'm also a policy and politics guy, and that's actually what we'd like to talk about. So, so first of all, I guess we should start in some sort of broad picture, which is okay, the COVID-19 hit basically every nation in the world, starting mainly in East Asia. Uh, South Korea seems to have distinguished itself as having done relatively well in containing the first wave of the epidemic, and it got a lot of praise. And quite unusually, the government popularity went up after the COVID-19 epidemic hit. So, what happened there in that first wave that created this unusually positive political response?
So I think the government acted very quickly and in a way that earned the people's trust. So recently there was an article on Foreign Affairs magazine by Francis Fukuyama who put together a good rubric on what kind of governments succeed and what kind of governments fail in when it comes to COVID-19 response. And he found that it had less to do with the forms of government, whether or not it was democratic, authoritarian, et cetera, et cetera. The variables were three variables. There's one, social trust; two, state capacity; and three, leadership. And if a country had all three, they had good response. If the country didn't have any of those threes, they had bad response. And what I might add to that rubric is that when you hear something like the word social trust, especially when you're dealing with a country in East Asia, people sort of automatically jump to this conclusion and say, "Oh, well, South Korea, those Confucians, hierarchical people, obedient to government authority, of course they're going to have social trust and cohesion." And I push back pretty strongly on that. I've written a few articles pointing out that that's just not true. The social trust measure in South Korea, actually, when you do empiricals, when you look at cross-cultural, cross-national empirical studies, South Korea's social trust is actually quite low. It's actually lower than the United States, lower than Western Europe, which means to me that the obvious conclusion is that whatever the government did earned the trust of the people. So I think that really was the crucial factor, that the government acted early, decisively, and in a way that demonstrated to the people that the government cared about their welfare, and the government will do everything it could to protect them. And I think that's what led to an actual successful response in terms of measurable success in terms of number of the infected and number of deaths. And also it translated to political success because the people were trusting of the government to do the right thing for them.
Well, before the pandemic hit, the president at that time, Moon Jae-In, he was having a lot of difficulties. He had a justice minister sort of problems, and he had, his popularity had declined below 50%, and the peace process with North Korea wasn't really looking like it was going very well. So how is it that this government that seemed to be kind of, I don't know, under siege in some ways, was able to stand up and perform in a way that earned the trust of the South Korean public?
All right. So let me start from sort of setting the right baseline. When South Korean presidents persistently have low approval ratings, so that's when you might say his approval rating was under 50%. That sounds bad, but it actually doesn't. Actually, it's not. The baseline for South Korean president usually it is around 40%. And so if the South Korean president's approval rating drops below 40%, then it's trouble. Beyond that, he or she is actually doing okay. So, but you're entirely correct that Moon Jae-in government started very high. At one point, his approval rating was over 80%, making him the most popular democratically elected leader in the world at the time. And a lot of it was backed by the fact that his predecessor, Park Geun-hye, was incredibly unpopular. She was impeached and removed. And also Moon Jae-in's peace process, at least initially, was very, very popular. And that normalized. Nobody can expect an 80% popularity rate to continue on for 5 years. It normalized down to 40%. And then when the justice minister scandal hit, that really was a significant hit, and his approval rating, according to some polls, dropped down to 32%. That was the lowest moment of his administration. And then, but what happened there? I think there is a very important moment in the previous presidency that we need to focus on, which is the ferry disaster, the Sewol ferry disaster that happened in February of 2014, and it was a capsized ferry, and the ferry was carrying mostly high school students who are going on a field trip, and they were all trapped in the ship and drowned, and it was happening live on live television. People were witnessing it in a very and they felt terrified and helpless. The rescue effort was inept and awful. And following the rescue effort, because the rescue effort was botched, the administration started turning against the victims and the survivors. As in, the administration started to make an enemy out of parents who just lost their children in that awful ferry accident, who are understandably blaming the bad rescue effort, rather than owning up to the mistake or trying to console them somehow. The government started making an enemy out of them, and that really was the beginning of the end for the Park Geun-hye presidency. That eventually led all the way down to impeachment. So the next administration, Moon Jae-in administration, comes in, and I think this really was a crystallized lesson that the Moon administration really, really internalized. That our government, this government, has to be the one that protects people. So you can see it again and again in the interviews with this administration's high officials. Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa gave an interview with a French television, France 24, making this exact point, that this administration learned from the mistakes of the Sewol ferry and committed itself to protecting the people. So the government went out of its way to make sure that not only not only were they actually protecting the people, they were a little showy about it, making sure that people were getting the sense that they were being protected. One major example I might point to is sending a chartered flight out to Wuhan to get all the Korean nationals out of the country. They ended up sending a number of charter flights all around the world to get to evacuate Korean nationals out, and that's not something that usually happened in the previous administration. And Koreans always sort of joke that, oh, the greatest thing about being an American is that no matter where you are, your government will get you out. And now they see the fact that, oh wow, our passport, our Mugunghwa passport, flower passport, also takes us out of dangerous areas, and that I could sense that was a really important moment where the public opinion started really warming up to the government, seeing that okay, they really care, and they are trying their best to protect us.
I believe one of the I don't know, characteristics which has been cited about the South Korean response was a very massive amount of testing that was done early on to try to contain the infection. So was that characteristic of the response, and were there other sort of unique points to how South Korea handled it that, for example, made them better off than Japan or some other countries in the world?
Right. I'm not sure if I can speak to Japan because, to be honest, I haven't followed Japan's response very carefully. But in terms of there are two parts to it. The way they ramped up the capacity and the way they used the capacity. And the way they ramped up the capacity is a great story. They basically saw the threat early. There's a great article, I believe, from the Reuters that sort of does a TikTok style timeline comparing South Korea's response to the response of the United States, because both countries basically had patient number one on the same day, and they had radically different responses, resulting in radically different consequences. Within 2 weeks of patient number one, South Korea's government authorities basically put all the pharmaceutical executives, in a conference room and told them that this wave is coming. We will need you to do everything you can, and once you develop test kits and protocols to test as many people as possible, we will make sure that you will be compensated. And that's an important part, because CDC, in the U.S. CDC, for example, U.S. CDC has 30,000 employees. KCDC has, I believe, several hundred. It's not a very big organization. It is not an organization that is meant to commandeer the entire process. What they do instead is they they can enlist the private sector in a way at times when needs are very acute, such that they don't have to maintain a huge bureaucracy all the time, but when the need arises, they can respond to it very flexibly. So that's the part about how the capacity was made. And then there's a part about how the capacity was deployed. And the part there, I think, is when the Daegu outbreak happened in February. So if you recall, in February, there was a giant outbreak that happened, concentrated on the city of Daegu, started by the Shincheonji cult. And this was a very difficult endeavor because the cult was secretive. They avoided testing. They lied to contact tracers. And it was a very difficult effort to do it, to stop the spread. And there was a real palpable fear that Daegu as a city would be under lockdown, it would be isolated, and it would be basically cut off from the rest of the society. And this was, you have to remember that this was February, right? This was before sort of nationwide lockdown became a kind of a normalized thing because everywhere in the world started doing so. This was a very early game, and nobody sort of knew what having a lockdown would mean. And the Korean government, to its credit, what it did is it never locked down Daegu. It never prohibited travel. The people there could continue traveling and go on with their lives, but they deployed the testing capacity to the maximum and tracing capacity to the maximum, so that they actually did trace everybody and isolate everybody who came into contact with the infected and managed to bring it all the way down. And that, again, is a moment where the government earned the trust of the people, because people saw that the government was met with this very serious challenge, and the government didn't threw up its hand. It didn't give up on a city. Instead, it just tried harder, and ended up bringing the outbreak under control.
Just one clarification. You said KCDC. Is that the Korean Center for Disease Control?
That's correct.
Okay, yeah. In Japan, we don't have any such institution, and this has been one of the discussions here. It was interesting to know that South Korea does have such an institution, and maybe that helped play a role in South Korea handling it better. So let's talk a little bit about that cult that you mentioned. They seem to have not only been playing a role in the initial spread in the first wave, but quite recently as well. We're hearing stories about them. So what has been their role within the COVID-19 pandemic, and why?
Well, there are two different. The second one is not a cult. It's actually mainstream Protestant churches. But let me back up and I'll explain further. So the big first wave happened in late February through March. And at that point, that made South Korea the leading country in the world in the number of cases for COVID-19, believe it or not, for about a month, until the rest of the world started catching up to it. And this cult is an offshoot of Christianity. The founder of the cult proclaims himself to be the second coming of Jesus. And their entire profile is pretend to be ordinary Christians, infiltrate regular churches, and gradually convert the churchgoers one by one into their cult. And they have been successful enough that there have been number of regular Protestant churches that were subject to essentially hostile takeover by this cult. They converted enough people within the church, and then threw out the pastor, and then installed their own pastor and take over the church entirely. And this made the contact tracing extremely difficult, because they were secretive about it. They refused to get tested for fear that they would be exposed. A lot of times, the members of the cult didn't even tell their own family that they belonged to this cult, and because they get together physically and chant, sing, say amen with big open mouths, with hundreds and thousands of people in the same room, it's an ideal breeding ground for the outbreak. So that happened initially, and then Korea managed to bring it all the way down around I would say April, May. And now, since about 2 weeks ago, we're seeing another wave in Korea, and this time it's slightly different. They're not cult, although you could say they might be a little cultish. They are hardcore evangelical Christians, very right-wing, and they dislike this current liberal government very, very much. They absolutely are convinced that Jae-In is a communist spy who's just getting ready to surrender the country to North Korea, and unless they protest in the streets, that South Korea will be communized at any moment. So they had their whole thing is street rallies, and they held a giant rally on August 15, Liberation Day for South Korea, which is a major holiday. And the worst part about this is that these churchgoers are not all from Seoul, because this rally was nationwide. All these different churches sent busloads of people up to Seoul to get together, rub shoulders with the infected, and then put them back on a bus back to all over Korea. And these folks tend to be older, whereas the Shincheonji cult that I referenced earlier tended to be on the younger side, people in their 20s and 30s, whereas these right-wing conservative Christians, they're in their 60s and older. So we are now seeing another a massive second wave, to a point where the South Korean government now has to very seriously consider locking down after never having locked down. And I think there is a theme. A theme is that, it goes back to the trust point that I was talking about. The successful response depends on social trust, and the government did what it could to earn the social trust for most people. But there will always be pockets of the society where that trust can never be earned. And that may be the case with the cult. That may be the case with when there's liberal government. That may be the case with very hardcore conservatives. And this will pop up again and again, and those groups will always be the vulnerabilities when it comes to the COVID-19 response.
Looking at politics, I mean, I must imagine that with all the bad press that both the original cult and now these evangelical hardcore conservatives, as you described them, there must be kind of among sort of people in the middle in Korea a lot of disgust towards their behavior and their role in spreading the COVID-19 pandemic. Do you see this as having a rollover political effect that strengthens the Moon government, or is this something where people will just shrug and it won't really have a major impact across the society?
I think it will have a significant impact, because prior to this, South Korea was achieving some level of normalcy, and people started doing sort of regular politics, quote unquote. So right prior to this, the biggest issue actually was reform in the real estate laws. The Moon government decided that the soaring housing prices were a huge issue for the urban middle class who couldn't afford a home. So they started cracking down on speculative real estate investment hard, and that was very, very unpopular with wealthier people or the older people whose livelihoods depend on being landlords. So once again, Moon government's approval rating dipped below that 40% marginal line, and that was on the second week of August, right before the Liberation Day rally started happening, and there's a sharp uptick again in support of the government. And then there's the other side of the coin is the conservatives. South Korea's conservatives are in pretty dire shape right now because, first of all, your previous conservative president was disgraced. Didn't just lose an election; she was actually expelled out of the Blue House. And then, since then, they lost 4 national elections in a row in a very resounding fashion. Latest one coming in April of this year. So they are really stripped bare when it comes to sort of institutional support. You need to win elections in order to have lawmakers, in order to have local governors and county leaders who will have budgets and projects and infrastructure, and that fuels the next election cycle. and they have very little of that remaining at this point. So what that means is naturally end up relying a lot more on these churches to drive up votes and fundraise. So earlier, prior to the April election, for example, the Conservative Party, the United Future Party, uh, co-hosted these rallies with these Christian groups. The party chairman would be often seen with the pastor of these churches on the same stage, giving speeches after another. And now, but that turned off sort of the middle lane voters entirely, and that contributed significantly to their landslide loss in April. So they were already on the downward trajectory, and now this happens, where the conservative evangelicals are now not just blamed for their sort of paranoid worldview, but now causing a second wave that might put the country into a lockdown. And what if South Korea's conservatives lose even this much infrastructure, their version of the civil society infrastructure, then they are truly left with very little, and they will be very far out in the wilderness before they can start climbing back into the halls of power.
Okay. So my second to last question then is, so what's the outlook now? I mean, we're now towards the end of August, and you mentioned that South Korea seems to be in the grips of the beginning of a second wave. Uh, so how bad do things look right now? Does this look like it's going to be worse than the first wave? Do we know yet? I mean, what's the current outlook as we stand today?
So here's a quick perspective. In the first wave, first it began with about 30 cases, and it peaked at around 900 cases a day. 30 cases a day, going to 900 cases a day, coming back down to 30 cases. And then second wave, again, we start at 30 cases. I think 3 days ago, it peaked. No, I shouldn't say peaked, but 3 days ago, that it reached a high of nearly 400 cases, and then it dipped a little bit down to between 200 and 300 cases a day right now, and that's been the situation for about a week. So the question now at this point is, did South Korea flatten the curve so that we are going through a long stretch of several hundred cases a day and then bring it down? Or will this grow exponentially and we go to a situation where all these other countries went through and have thousands of cases per day, to a point where both hospitals and contact tracers are completely overwhelmed and they can no longer trace where the virus is going? And it's a very important moment at this point, and we won't know for sure for another good several days.
Okay, and the final question from me before we go to the patron Q&A, which is off the record, is there something that I should have asked you that I didn't ask you about this COVID-19 issue in South Korea that needs to be commented on?
I think the one thing that I always emphasize is that when people look at an Asian country, they sort of assume this obedient population, harmonious society, and I think that idea just needs to be rejected very strongly. And so one example I might bring up that I didn't get to bring up earlier is that South Korea's doctors actually were very strongly against the government's measures, because the doctors themselves are very conservative. They're a high-earning profession. In fact, right now, the doctors are conducting a strike in the middle of the second wave because they oppose the government's plan to increase the number of medical licenses and capacity for medical school. But at the time, when the February outbreak was happening, the doctors were so against the government that they were claiming the presidential advisory board was needed to be replaced by taking because they let the outbreak happen in Daegu, and they it worked. The presidential advisory board in the middle of the pandemic resigned in mass because of the pressure from the Korean Medical Association, the KMA. And when you think about that, right, and it feels like a miracle that Korea managed to pull this off as well as it did, and it was not because of lack of fractious politics or anything like that. People tend to, especially people looking at things from the United States or Western Europe, looking at their own politics and say, well, our politics are so polarized and fractious. I bet other countries don't have it as bad as us. No, other countries have it exactly as bad as exactly bad as everybody else. It's just that there's competent leadership, there's decisive response early on, and that's really what made a difference.
All right, very good. So that's I've learned a huge amount already, and I'm ready to learn a little bit more as we open it up to the patron Q&A. So